needs to say. 2% transfer fee has received some attention. That's in section, identified as being something that needs to be added to section 26 in Cahoda's presentation or items. Now that 2% transfer fee was something that was negotiated. It's something that we are pursuing. And the way we're pursuing that is the only way I know how, which is to put a waiver into the rent and fee schedule, which is where that 2% transfer fee is located. So we'll be asking the board to waive that requirement or make that amendment to the rent and fee schedule when it comes up on its ordinary schedule. And but just as a precaution, we're also requesting that the board, when this comes to the board, implement a waiver, a temporary waiver, until we get to the rent and fee schedule.
Question on that. 10 years from now, and they do a new rates and fees, and nobody remembers the 2%, how does it get carried over?
Well, it will say in the rent and fee schedule that the which leases are not subject to the transfer fee. In other words, the rent and fee schedule will be amended to say that these leases are not subject to the 2% transfer fee.
So that lease will be, I'm having a hard time figuring how you would do that so that it didn't get lost, because you're going to have a long series of various leases. Is it going to be private hangar owners will not be facing a 2% fee listed in the rates and fees?
It'll be identified, yes, in the rent and fee schedule. The exact language hasn't been written yet, but yes.
Okay. So yeah, that helps us to understand, is it just hangar owners, or is it every single number, lease number put on there?
In the rent and fee schedule, no, that won't be necessary. It'd be simply, so currently that transfer fee, because most, I don't think any of the aircraft storage hangar leases are term leases, right? So the requirement in the rent and fee schedule currently is worded to apply to term leases, leases of greater than 5 years, I believe it says, are subject to the 2% fee. So the wording change, like I said, hasn't been written yet, but it would simply say that term leases of privately owned hangar, for privately owned hangars will be exempt from something to that effect.
Thank you, that's helpful.
Sure. Gate cards, a hotter issue than it needs to be. The lease is a lease of real property, and the lease automatically entitles a person to the exclusive use and enjoyment of that real property. By the same token, so a tenant has a right to access his or her hangar, right, under the lease. By the same token, the county needs to have the flexibility to deal with issues that come up with the access system to the airfield, whether it's a change of vendor, whether the system goes down, whether somebody's abusing the system, what have you. We need to have the flexibility to allow access to tenants' hangars in manners other than simply what's being done right now. And so that's the sole purpose of this section, or the provision of this section that has raised controversy, is that the county wants to be able to balance providing access with the flexibility that's needed to deal with changes to the system. So as the lease is currently worded, if the county does swap out or modify or revoke or disable a gate key, the county must also provide an alternative means of access. And that's sort of lease law 101. If we were to lock out a tenant who has a valid lease, that's illegal.
Can I ask a question? Just a wording switch. It states that the county may, in its sole discretion for county's convenience, provide lessee one or more access keys. Is it convenience or necessity? Like, why would we shut the cards down? It's because there's a need for doing that, correct?
Well, the access keys are provided for the county's convenience. The county needs to maintain the airport as a secure area, and the county could pay sentries to stand at every gate and check identities and let people on the airfield. We're not doing that. We could provide some other means of access. So it's at the county's convenience. We will choose the method that's best for providing the security while minimizing the cost and making it most efficient for everybody. Currently, that's the gate key system. I'm not aware of any plans to change it, but these things do change over time. We have had issues in the past with the gate key vendor, as I'm sure anybody who's been to the airports has experienced from time to time. This is simply to deal with that issue.
So you're
There-
saying it has to be a convenience, it's not a necessity. Okay.
I see what you've written, but it doesn't necessarily strike me as if I have my gate card zeroized because I forgot to take my driving test and John got me. It doesn't say what other means you have. It says media, but media doesn't mean anything to me. So I know that you can call ops and ops will escort you through the gate to your hangar, but it doesn't say it's the lack of clarity on that sentence that bothers me, not the, I know how it works, and that's not to me what it read.
Well, like I said, the lease itself is your license to access your hangar. And so you have, this document gives you the right to access your
But
hangar.
in the day we are today, the gate key is the only way that's got a 24-hour access to my hangar,
Okay?
period. If you're calling, if you land and there's no operations officer there at 2 o'clock in the morning, probably shouldn't have landed anyway, but anyway. But the reality is that there's not going to be 24/7 coverage to get you in and out of the gate. The only access you have is the gate card unless you go through the waypoints push button, and and then you get into their area and then you're stuck. So the question I've got is, the way it needs to read is a little more clear that you have a way to get to your hangar and out instead of at the
Convenient.
convenience of the airport. We'll let you in or out depending on how we feel that day. I mean, that's not what it is, but that's what it reads.
No, that's not what it says. The provision of access media, the general term for the type of thing that's going to get you through the gate, is issued at the county's convenience. In other words,
That I understand.
as opposed to manning the gates with people you got to pay. So that's done at the county's convenience. If the county does not provide a gate card at an access media, we have to provide another means of access. That's what it says. If we disable the gate card, if the gate card stops working, if it's swapped out or
The other
revoked,
type of access is the media. Okay.
then we have to provide another means of access.
Do we have
Is there a
an
reason
emergency
why you
phone number?
couldn't say that there instead of media? Media doesn't
Okay, option
mean
would-
another way of access to me. Is that what it means?
Access media means access keys, cards, or other media to enable lessee to enter the secured area of the airport.
I just never thought of a operations officer as media.
Nor would I. That's not what it says, though. The access media is the device that gets you through the gate.
And the gate's broken, so how do you get through the gate?
You call the
The
operator.
county must provide a different means of access.
That's exactly, why can't you just say that?
I'm sorry, sir, I believe it does say that.
It just says other media.
It says other media. That was my question.
Come on, let's go.
Am I reading that wrong?
Mr. Prell, Kip, when someone gets a lease, do they pay extra for a gate card, or does it come with the lease? It says you have two, but I mean, do you pay extra for that? Yes. You do pay extra. So someone could lease a hangar without getting gate card key. They didn't pay extra. Someone could lease a hangar and not get a gate card key because they wanted to save some money. Right or wrong? Yeah. Okay.
But the question then is, how would you ever get to your hangar?
I don't know.
You can't. The answer is you can't.
The answer is you have a legal right to, and the county must provide that alternative access according to the terms of the lease.
We're in total agreement.
Okay?
He just uses the operator as media, any type of
Okay,
media as a
that-
person So the gate gets opened by either a card or a person or a key or something.
Yeah, if we switched to master locks on chains, you would get a key, right? So it's an alternative means. The county must provide that access. The county has open flexibility as to how to provide that access. Access media is simply the electronic means that, like what's currently used.
I'd like to ask a follow-up question on that.
Sure.
Okay, if I'm tight, and I don't want to pay for the key, but I rent the hangar, and I stand by the gate and wait for the first car to go through, and then I step through the gate. Am I in hot water with the airport authority?
Yes.
But you've provided access because the gate opened, and I went through the gate, an open gate.
Yeah,
I mean, I didn't say
Yeah.
you, but I mean, why should I be in hot water? I mean, access was provided, somebody else opened the gate, and I walked through. But I own but I leased the hangar, and I'm entitled to access to my hangar. And I just took access to my hangar by walking through a gate that somebody else opened.
Yeah, I apologize. I can't speak to that because I'm not familiar enough with the way it works at the airport. I assume there's a number of ways. You could hop the fence, you could
Mr. Chair.
parachute in, that sort of thing. I'm really only concerned with what the lease says. The lease says we must provide alternative access
Chair.
if we disable the access key.
Can I use the county as an example? We all have, our keys to get in, our cards. And if I put my card in, I cannot allow somebody to follow me into the building. They got to have their own card. I mean, that's basically what happens here.
But we all do it, right?
I haven't done it.
Because it's impolite not to.
But with the FAA, if you do it, you can get arrested, so that's the difference.
There you go.
Anything else? All right, council, you can proceed.
So the next item that's not necessary to change, despite Cahoda's request, is whether subleasing is allowed. In sections 35, in section 35 primarily, but also as you can see reflected in section 39 sub F, subleasing is allowed under the conditions that are reflected in section 35, and assignment of the lease, meaning essentially assigning all of the rights under the lease to a third party, is also allowed under the circumstance when the hangar is to be sold or is sold. That's what 35 and 39 say. The change requested by Cahoda is not necessary. There's also a question by Cahoda relating to Section 2 that says there's no language in there allowing for lease assumption by a buyer. Again, that's stated in Section 35 and reflected also in Section 39, 39F.
Could I get your thoughts on 35, assignment and subletting? Is it worthy of splitting those two so you understand what assignment is, and then the next one would be subletting, just to make sure it's very accurate and stand out?
And when
more?
you say splitting,
So you have one part is the assignment, and the second part is the subletting. So instead of 35 and 36 would be subletting.
oh, I see, in a separate section?
Yes, to make sure it's more clear. I don't think that would be hard to do, but it might be more clear just for in case one versus the other.
Yeah, I mean, if what you're talking about is simply adding a separate section and taking some of what's in 35 and sticking it in a new section, that wouldn't change the meaning of the lease.
Yes, please.
So my question on that is, if I sold my hangar at year 8 and I have a 20-year lease, how will the person I sold it to know that he's got a choice the way I understand it? He can either renegotiate the lease, he can maintain the next 12 years, or something else, but I couldn't get that out of reading it.
Is that on 2B? Because it says at the expiration of the term of any extension, lease must either transfer ownership to the hangar, or should it be at any time sold? So at expiration, so I buy a hangar, the expiration of 20 years, right? Then you've got an extension. So 10 years, I sell it to someone else, and they pick up. So it's at any time they're still going to get that time, right?
10 years.
Well,
Sorry.
so if you sell it you got the 20 years. You sell your hangar, you do all the things that the county, the lease says you do to transfer the ownership.
Right.
Do you tell the person who bought the hangar, should they expect 10 years the way it is, or an option of going back to the Department of Airports and say, I want to renegotiate, and I want my 20-year to start now? Is that the two options?
Those two options, I believe, are, the way the lease is written, those two options are available.
But I had a heck of a time finding that without knowing more than the lease says.
So does that 2B clearly say that, I guess is the question? At any time sold or
In-
at the expiration of the term?
So in 39F, it talks about if the lessee elects to sell the hangar in place. And you read through that section, it describes the process of what must happen. And so it's for the purpose of either assigning this agreement, this is about in the middle of the paragraph, 39F, assigning this agreement or terminating this agreement and executing a new agreement for lease of the land occupied by the hangar. Those are the two options that are available at that point.
Oh, okay.
How long do they have to make that determination? How long do they have to make the choice?
I don't believe the lease states a deadline on there.
So if they remain silent, they just go to the end of the original lease?
Correct.
Okay, so the 2 is the terms of the original lease.
Yes, an assignment of the lease means assigning all of your remaining rights under the lease
Okay,
to the new owner.
okay. And so then the lease assumptions goes to 39F. All right, you got to jump all over to read all this stuff. Just saying. Yeah. Agreed.
Virtually all contracts are.
Yep. Okay.
All right, counsel?
So that's the last of the 5 of those unnecessary items I wanted to address. There are 14 more similar unnecessary changes that are proposed by Cahota. So I've taken up way too much of your time already. I know there's plenty of people that want to speak on this item, and it's getting late. So I will turn it over if there aren't any further questions. Thank you.
Before we get to public comments, do we have any additional questions from either of the authorities?
Yeah. I'd like to know what the rest of at least the Oxnard Airport Authority, do you feel it's worth hearing the other 14 concerns that they have?
No.
All right,
Can I ask a couple questions? On number 11, it says additional stored aircraft. So as long as one aircraft works, they're okay and nothing's going to be triggered? Is that correct? Because it says conditions may arise in the middle of it, that there's necessary that the county to withdraw temporary or permanently for the second aircraft. So I'm just, when does that kick in?
I'm sorry, when does what kick in?
It says that failure to obtain approval of the storage of any additional aircraft.
It's the last sentence.
Right. So I'm just wondering, when is it that you couldn't store that second plane or parts in your hangar? If you already have one that's been approved and it's okay, why would the second ever have to be checked on? Or, I'm just asking, because sometimes they use it for parks, and so it'll never be air ready. So I'm just asking that question.
Just to store the second plane, is that what it is?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they might not be working on it to get it air
You
ready.
have plane 1, and then now you're asking to put a second.
Yeah, and you're saying that the second one has to be air ready, so I was just wondering.
Right.
Is that clear or
A
not?
plane that's, I think you're referring to an item in the lease known as the aircraft under construction, which is an aircraft that's not airworthy and is in the process of becoming airworthy. So that's a separate section.
It's number 9.
That's 9, but then 11 says additional stored aircraft.
The last sentence on 11.
So I just wondered when it kicks in that you could
Kelly, is your question more, is the additional stored aircraft, do the other tenants of this lease pertain to the additional stored aircraft? Must it be airworthy? Do the conditions of how long an aircraft can be essentially inoperable, does that apply to the additional stored aircraft? Or does it only apply to the primary?
'Cause I would think it would only be the primary.
Can I have a primary airplane that's that I'm flying day in and day out, and can I have a secondary airplane that's just my hobby airplane? It can be in whatever state I want it to be, and it doesn't necessarily need to be.
Because
Is that okay?
Yeah, because I thought the goal was we need at least one plane working. So why are we giving them issues on the second one? So that's why I'm asking.
I would think you need it to comply with the contract. If you have a plane one, you want to put another plane in there, you have to have approval. Is that?
No.
No?
No.
That's not what it says here? I thought it says failure to obtain approval for somebody.
It does say that it triggers, so
As
that's
long as
why I was
one's
asking.
working? Okay.
The way the lease is framed or is sort of structured currently, the idea is that the hangar is used to store an aircraft, a single aircraft. The additional stored aircraft section here would apply when the hangar owner wants to store an additional aircraft beyond the aircraft that's identified in the beginning of the lease in Section 1. So the additional stored aircraft is a second, and I don't know if any of the hangars are large enough to store a third. But those would fall under the additional stored aircraft. An additional stored aircraft, as I read the lease, is not the same thing as an aircraft under construction, which has a different set of rules.
Yes.
With respect to the question of aircraft under construction, at the advisory committee meeting just recently, there was a lot of questions about how long it takes to build an airplane and the time frame and who's going to make the determination. How does this body feel that it will be fairly, how does this body know that it will be fairly decided that Hangar A is taking a long time to build it, Hangar B is taking a long time to build it, and they'll both get treated equally?
A couple of things. I think it's important to point out, today's lease doesn't allow that at all. Doesn't allow many of the things that we're talking about. These are provisions that we've thrown in a good faith effort to move this lease forward. Good faith is a couple of strong words there that I think keep getting overlooked in the context of a lot of this discussion tonight and in the previous nights before. This is an item that we do not feel is an issue for us, and that's why we threw it in. And there is no intent other than to allow that. We've actually built in a provision for the aircraft under construction. It could even be an aircraft under construction that occupies the hangar without a working aircraft. It's a very lengthy provision. The FAA actually double questioned whether or not we really wanted to offer that or not. And I said, yeah, we do. We want to do that for our customers here. And so, and it's got a provision in there where we can extend that and we can keep extending that beyond. We purposely did not put an end life on it so that we would have the opportunity to keep extending that. One of the things that we have to abide by every single day are 39 grant assurances, because every time we take a grant, we take an oath and a pledge for another 20 years on these 39 grant assurances that we agree to. Many of those grant assurances are protection rights to all of our users. So those grant assurances ensure that we don't treat one person different than we treat another. And that's on any facet of anything of any use of the airport.
Thank you for the answer.
So that's a benefit that's a benefit, for having the second plane in there.
Most of these have been added benefits that we threw in good faith efforts to try to show that we're trying to work with this community.
Which I think is good for okay.
So they just have to approve, they have to obtain approval from the county that's.
That's on the,
That's only on the first one. The second one doesn't have a time frame.
Right. Additional stored aircraft does not have a time limit.
No.
It's the aircraft under construction. It's 1 year with extensions so long as progress toward airworthiness is shown.
Right, and so that was the question, because the second one might not have progress after the year. So that's what the question.
Yeah, but that's a different idea altogether. That's additional stored working aircraft.
Yes, okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
not under construction.
Thank you.
Any additional comment or question?
No,
at this time?
the 1 year one was the flag, and I understand it, and that's just, everyone knows that probably 4 or 5 years is more likely So in some, it's worse than that. But progress is the key.
All right, at this time, we're going to move to comments from the public. I have a whole list of comment cards. I'm going to take them in order that I received them. And I'm going to start, and with a caveat here, Mr. Scott Bear, I know you represent many of the hangar owners as president of Cohoda, and you had asked me prior to the meeting if you could have some additional time in your response. As a representative, and so I'm going to use my discretion to provide 15 minutes or up to 15 minutes of time to present in your comments.
15 minutes?
Do the others get to speak? Does he represent all of them?
The only thing I'd ask, Mr. Chairman, is the county's taken the better part of an hour on their presentation. I'm going to try to keep it to 15 minutes. If I need a minute or two more, I'd appreciate that. And I'd like to see if I can get the clock reset until we get the PowerPoint.
Sure.
Okay. Mr. Chairman and members of the Camarillo and Oxnard Airport Authorities, thank you for the opportunity to speak this evening. My name is Scott Bearer, and I'm the president of the Camarillo Oxnard Hangar Owners and Tenants Association, known as Cohoda. Cohoda represents approximately 225 hangar owners and tenants at Camarillo and Oxnard airports. As you all know, maybe too well, the issue of transitioning from the current month-to-month lease to a term lease has been ongoing for several years. The issues are difficult, and at times the dialogue between the county and the hangar owners has been contentious. After several starts and stops, with little progress being made, and then a long delay while the county sought a new airport director, Mr. Turner was hired, and talks resumed. However, after only 2 meetings between Mr. Turner and Cohoda, the county announced its intent to impose its last, best, and final offer. Make no mistake, progress had been made on many issues, and the Department of Airports has added some very helpful provisions. But there are still many issues left unresolved, including the lease term. Now, months after the county ended the talks, a draft lease has been prepared by Department of Airports staff and is being considered this evening. Make no mistake, this draft has only been around for a few weeks, and it only got started being written sometime late last year. So the representation that this draft has been worked on for 5 years isn't accurate. In a lengthy document, a previous version of which, of the document you all received tonight, Cohoda asked the Department of Airports to make changes. Despite multiple requests, the Department of Airports has refused to meet with Cohoda in person to work on resolving the lease issues. Instead, the department would only consider emails and the suggestions in emails. Now, to its credit, the department has made some of the requested changes that were put in emails, but many issues remain unresolved. Significantly, there have been many representations, including from Mr. Turner just a few minutes ago, that the county wants the hangar owners at the airports. But despite that, the lease draft contains several gotcha provisions with the apparent goal of making it easier for the county to terminate a lease unrelated to Ventura County airports. If the county wants private hangar owners at the airports, why does the lease have gotcha provisions that make it easier for the lease to be terminated? We're mindful of the hard work that Mr. Turner's staff has put in to produce the draft, but unfortunately, it is just not ready for prime time. We've asked the Department of Airports to push the pause button for a brief respite so that simple issues and mistakes can be resolved. But despite our efforts to resolve the issues in the lease, it appears the lease is being done quickly after this hangar lease issue has been pending for years, and getting it done quickly is being prioritized over getting it done right. Significantly, the Department of Airports is asking the Camarillo and Oxnard airport authorities to approve a lease virtually identical to a version that the Aviation Advisory Commission declined to approve last week. With that as a backdrop, I will now turn to specific examples of areas in the lease that we believe require revision. Please keep in mind that these are just a few of the problems, and as you all know, you've got a complete list of our concerns. So the first issue has been talked about a bit, and I won't belabor it, but on the very first page, the lease asks for a pilot license number, certificate number. And as has been discussed, oftentimes the older pilot's licenses use the Social Security number as the license number. Now, when you look at the certificate number, it's just a series of numbers. It's not going to be broken out like a Social Security number. So the likelihood that someone at the county would know that those however many digits are a Social Security number is relatively low. It's not set out as a Social Security number on the certificate. So for example, this is my certificate from 1994. If you look at the area that's in the red oval circle, you'll see that I've redacted it. I don't want my Social Security number out in public, but that's my Social Security number underneath that redaction. And so there should be no question that that number should not appear on the face of the lease. It's a public document, and if with that on the front of the lease, it potentially exposes the hangar owner to identity theft.
I don't know.
And even there's talk that, well, we'll just redact the lease and that's how the county is trained. But even Mr. Temple acknowledged, and his exact words were, that sometimes it slips through the cracks. And so if there's even the slightest potential for it slipping through the cracks and someone's Social Security number being subject to a Public Records Act request, the county needs to take steps to avoid that from happening 100% of the time. And the way to do that is not require that number on the first page of the lease. In the second paragraph, and this has been touched on, the county's deleted the explicit language about lease assumption, even though this was negotiated and agreed upon with Mr. Turner during our talks. There's no reason not to include a clear statement authorizing assumption of the existing owner's lease, especially because this was something we agreed on in our discussions with the county. But as you can see here, it's been redlined out of the lease, even though it was there earlier. With regard to paragraph 6, it doesn't take into account a subleasing situation where a hangar owner may no longer own an airplane, but he still can own a hangar and he can sublease it to someone. So there should be no requirement that a hangar owner necessarily own an aircraft. A hangar owner can own the hangar, he can lease it out, he can let one of his family members use it with their owned aircraft. So these issues need to be broken out separately and not included as one issue and one point. Under the aircraft under construction language, yes, I hear what the county's saying about, well, we'll after a year we'll give approval, but the problem is that the FAA doesn't view it that way. And literally when you build an airplane, lives are at stake. It shouldn't be rushed. And rather than have an arbitrary time limitation, what the FAA says is as long as there's a showing of periodic progress, that's sufficient. You can't walk into a hangar and see 6 inches of dust on a plane and say, oh, it's under construction. It's clearly not. But if there's a reasonable showing of progress as the airplane is built, that's all that's necessary. The 1-year language is something that shouldn't be in there. Now let's talk about, because I know Mr. Temple had a lengthy discussion about what he termed as a non-issue. In fact, it is an issue. Under the terms of Section 28, the county retains in its sole discretion to provide 1 or more access keys. Got it. That's certainly appropriate. But nowhere in this language, and I don't have the whole section up there, but you all have the lease in front of you, nowhere in Section 28 does it say that the county is obligated to provide alternative access. Now, one way to fix this is take out the word may and change it to shall, and take out in its sole discretion altogether, and say that for the county's convenience, it'll provide 1 or more means of access to the hangar. But there's an obligation there. The word may makes it at the county's discretion, and in fact, the lease itself says at the county's discretion. Paragraph 35. At best, it's inconsistent, and at best, it's confusing, and at worst, it's just internally inconsistent. The first sentence talks about that the the contract may not be assigned, and then later it says that it may not be transferred, sublet, assigned, et cetera, without county's prior approval. And I think the suggestion that was raised earlier, I believe it was Supervisor Long or somebody else on the panel said, why not break that out into a separate paragraph, starting where the highlighted language starts? I think that would provide a lot of clarity and would go a long way toward alleviating concern about subleasing. In paragraph 37, the likely scenario in a lease termination is that the Department of Airports would seek to terminate the lease for alleged noncompliance. However, there is no process for the department's actions to be reviewed other than, as Mr. Temple said several times, for someone to go into court and spend money and engage in unlawful detainer action. The lease should provide for a review, some level of review, of all decisions to terminate a lease, with the opportunity for an informal resolution before the parties head to court. Court is expensive, it's time-consuming, the county has infinite resources, the hangar owners do not have infinite resources, and we need to level the playing field a little bit by trying to create a situation where we can reach an informal resolution before everybody goes to guns, so to speak, and heads to court. And as far as dispute resolution is concerned, I'll discuss that in detail in a minute. This is an item, paragraph 38, that is a hot button for our membership. Under this section, especially the highlighted language at the bottom, any violation of local, state, or federal law, essentially related to the airport, or where the violation is in any way related to the airport, the aircraft, the hangar, provides that the lease can immediately be terminated. So let's talk about, for a minute, what immediate termination means and what an action that relates to a certificate, for example, means. Let's say I'm taking my plane to Oklahoma, thousands of miles away from here, and I accidentally violate an airport's airspace. And there's an FAA action against me, and ultimately it's decided I'm going to take a 30-day suspension of my pilot's license because I violated a regulation and I went into this airport inappropriately. So for that infraction, a 30-day suspension by the FAA, for an incident in Oklahoma, I can lose my hangar lease here in Ventura County. And Mr. Temple confirmed that. And that's just wrong. The issues should be related to Ventura County, to Ventura County airports, and not make it so that any small, this is one of the gotcha items, any small FAA violation that one of our members might commit can result in a hangar lease being terminated. And in fact, other leases on the airport do not have such immediate termination language. This is the table of contents from the RKR lease for the Cloud 9 development. And no, I'm not picking on RKR, at least not tonight, but there's no similar language for immediate termination in their lease. Now think about it for a second. The RKR project, or the Cloud 9 project, involves city, county, state, and federal laws, with more potential for violations, and yet there's no provision in their lease for immediate termination. So why should the small guys, without the infinite resources of Mr. Rassick and RKR, be subject to immediate termination when this lease has no immediate termination provisions in it? It's a question of fundamental fairness as much as anything. And as far as the draconian language, I think Dr. Fussell referred to it as such, and I agree with him wholeheartedly. Paragraph 38 is draconian, and it's overbroad as highlighted by the fact that the lease already contains provisions requiring compliance with local, state, and federal laws. There it is, Section 26. So why put an immediate termination provision in the lease for what could be a minor FAA violation when we have a requirement here under 26 to comply with local, state, and federal laws? Again, it's one of those gotcha things, and it makes us all wonder whether the county, despite saying they want us as tenants, whether they really don't want us as tenants. This was touched on previously. In the event of a lease dispute, including over unpaid rent, paragraph 40 allows not only a lien to be placed on the hangar, but everything inside the hangar. My tools, if I've got a car in there, a golf cart. The issue here is lease ownership, is hangar ownership and compliance with the lease with regard to the hangar. The lease should not give the county the right to take my golf cart, put a lien on my golf cart, my tools, if I've got a car stored in there, in addition to the hangar. It's overbroad, it's overreaching, and again, it's one of those draconian measures. I've got about 30 seconds and I need about 3 more minutes. May I take it?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. In paragraph 46, there's specific provisions for discrimination prohibitions on race, color, or national origin. However, it doesn't include things like gender, religion, disability, and I can't imagine the county would want a lease on its books that at least implicitly allows certain types of discrimination. Our view is that it should prohibit all types of discrimination. So this is a situation where we're actually looking for something more restrictive rather than less. And now we come to dispute resolution, which has been something that's been discussed with me at great length in my meetings with some of you. Mr. Temple spent a lot of time talking about unlawful detainer actions, and the parties can go to court and they can resolve it in court and they can hire lawyers in court and on and on and on about court and legal action, and you can go to a jury trial. And the question I kept asking myself as I listened to Mr. Temple make his presentation was, why do we have to resort to that? Why don't we have some sort of process where we can everybody take a step back, get somebody in the middle, maybe work with a local bar association to provide a mediator, we can work out the mechanisms later, and have a simple dispute resolution process. Someplace where the parties can calm down, take a deep breath, and try to figure out a way anyway to solve their problem rather than court and unlawful detainer and attorneys and jury trials. It was exhausting listening to it, and I kept seeing dollar signs. I'm a lawyer, and I kept seeing dollar signs as I heard the description of what a tenant would have to go through if there was an issue related to his lease. So had we had some sort of dispute resolution process when Andy Risk was going through his situation with the county, there's at least a chance that that situation could have been resolved without, I don't know, he spent $100,000. I don't know how many countless hours of staff time was spent on it. Why not have some sort of opportunity to resolve it without going to court? And if I could get the clock stopped for just a minute, and I'd call everybody's attention to the screen, and I'd ask that they get a chance to look at it, and without the clock continuing to tick down. Mr. Chairman, could we get a pause on the clock for a minute?
No, I already gave you an extension, so.
I'd like to disagree. Can we pause?
Let's just go for it. Let's
All
just
right,
get it done.
thank
All
you.
right, we'll spend more time arguing the.
This is a basic dispute resolution clause. There's nothing magic about this. It's something I pulled off the internet this afternoon and added this slide to the presentation. It's pretty simple. And it's just one form, just one option that I put together. We could change it from someone, from the airport authority to someone from the local bar association if we worked with them. The point being is that I'm sure that if Mr. Temple and I, if the county was open to that kind of process, I'm sure Mr. Temple and I could sit down and in an hour and a half, 2 hours, we could come up with language that would work. We can start the clock again. Gahoda is grateful to the Department of Airports for the hard work that staff has put in to compile the lease agreement. Our criticism should not be construed as ingratitude. And though we have vigorously disagreed on issues since Mr. Turner came on board, we've never made it personal. Rather, we're trying to identify the problems and then be part of the solution and fix the problems. In closing, let me say this. I've met with several of you prior to this evening, and in one meeting I was taught that one of the roles for the airport authorities is to support the Department of Airports. It was a perspective I had not considered before. And in the role of supporting the Department of Airports, it seems to me the airport authorities should also support the department's efforts to get things right. Not fast, but right. As I drove home from the meeting, it occurred to me that the airport authorities are the gatekeepers as well. The bodies determine what these bodies, I have another paragraph, can I finish it?
Finish it.
These bodies determine what goes before the Board of Supervisors for approval when it comes to the airport. And not only do 2 members of the Board of Supervisors sit on the advisory authorities, but also 4 members from the city of Oxnard and Camarillo and 2 members of the public. So in addition to supporting the Department of Airports, the members of these bodies should also support should also support the public in its relationship with the airports. We are your constituents, your neighbors, voters, county taxpayers, and the Department of Airports customers. As written, the lease is at times draconian, unfair, ambiguous, and it fails to contain at least one critical negotiated provision. We urge you to vote no on this lease and instead ask staff to work with us to ensure the document we will all have to live with for the next 20 years is fair, accurate, and reflects our agreements. Mr. Chairman and members of the authority, I thank you for the time to speak tonight. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the extra few minutes, and I'm happy to answer questions if anybody has any.
Thank you very much. Next, we're going to hear from Mr. Mark Sullivan. And Mark Karnick, you're on deck.
I guess they're paying that guy, right?
Good evening. I'm Mark Sullivan. I am not a hangar owner. I am, however, a hangar renter from the county and have been for about 36 years. My interest is basically representing fellow, renters from the county and people that are interested in eventually buying a hangar. I'd like to buy one myself. I'm going to address three points that were brought up tonight that I think are wrong and that are quite important to your consideration here. First of all, I just went on the FAA webpage, the pilot registry webpage, looked at my own airman certificate. It does not show my number. So that portion of the presentation is wrong. It does not show the number. It's not an item that the FAA is putting out there. It is a relatively guarded number. And it's particularly so with respect to Social Security, which the Civil Code makes it illegal to be, publicizing. So I think that's Sheila Ann Haskins' point is a really serious point. It's not a throwaway point. Second item is that Mr. Temple talked about UD, the UD process as being something that will protect people's rights. Well, that's completely a fallacious argument in the case of a commercial lease. We all know about residential tenancies. In a residential tenancy, the court will consider whether or not the landlord's been fair, and all these other issues can be considered under covenants of habitability and the like. In the case of a commercial lease, you're limited solely to whether or not there was a breach of the lease, even if it's a draconian provision in the lease. Did you or did you not breach it? And if you did, the county or the landlord takes possession. You then have a right to sue for damages for all those fairness issues. So all the issues of fairness, the things that people are concerned about here, will never get addressed in a UD process. They are not germane to a UD process. A judge will cut you off immediately if you try to go into them. The sole issue is possession. And with this lease, the county could, declare the right to possession on some fairly small items. So Admiral Fussel's reference to draconian is absolutely right, and the court's not going to be a remedy for that. That is not a dispute resolution process. Finally, on the provision of indemnity, I don't understand Mr. Temple's argument. The CAHOA never argued for no indemnity. Their concern was that in this lease, unlike the RKR lease, for example, the county inserted a provision that basically says that the renter or the hangar owner will indemnify the county for everything except for items caused by the sole negligence of the county. In other words, you're the insurer for the county except when they're the sole cause. I would ask you, if you look at the RKR lease and look at their indemnity clause, that language does not appear. At the very minimum, the lease for the little guys should have the same indemnity clause as the lease for the big guys, not a draconian, you insure the county for its own wrongdoing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, Mr. Mark Karnick, you are up, and David Is it Harris? David Harris, you're on deck.
Hi. Thank you very much. My name is Mark Harnick. I am a private hangar owner at the Camarillo Airport. I want to offer a little clarification with regard to item number 38 in the lease, which is the immediate termination clause. And I think I understand what the county is trying to do here. The county is, in drawing a distinction between item number 26, they're trying to say that, well, for some violations of the lease, a 30-day cure with notice is appropriate. And for some violations of the lease, which are so serious that a 30-day cure is not appropriate, that there would be an immediate termination. The problem is that the things that are covered for a 30-day default are the exact same things that are covered for immediate termination. So anything that is subject to a 30-day cure with a notice of a default can also be looped into number 38, which calls for immediate termination. And so if you're going to take a step so draconian is the word that's been used, to terminate the lease, there should be a clear indication of what offenses that would determine and would deserve that serious of a consequence, and there simply is not. And so there's no difference between what could be given notice of a default and a 30-day cure, or what can be immediate termination. And my belief is that the entirety of Section 38 should be stricken from the contract. It serves no purpose. It serves no public purpose. There's no benefit to the public or to the residents of Ventura County or the home or the hangar owners. It's simply a measure that's been inserted by the Department of Airports to give them what I think are overbroad enforcement rights. And I want to. So I think it should just be stricken altogether. Section 26 covers the necessary requirements for compliance with state and local laws in a way that I think is fair-minded. I'd like to say one last thing with my minute. So there's been discussion of the cancer on the airports, and I think that's pretty unfortunate language, and I share your sensitivity to that. What I would say is that if you look at the history, for 38 years, going back to the early 80s, the month-to-month lease was governing the sale and possession of hangars, and there were never any problems. There was never any litigation that I was aware of. There was enforcement actions like there always will be, but there was never any problems. So for 38 years, the airport operated in relative harmony, and it's only since the last 3.5 years, because remember, in November of 2016, Todd McNamee was still saying that the month-to-month lease had stood the test of time, and they would want to change it. So if there is a cancer, then it's a cancer that has only afflicted us for the last 3.5 years since the process of changing this lease has begun. And I just want you to bear that in mind, and I hope that the Director of Airports bears that in mind as well. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. David Harris, you are up, and is it last name Smith? Is it Gwen Smith? Owen Smith, you're on deck.
Hello, my name is David Harris. I own a hangar at Oxnard Airport. I would like to thank Kip for dropping by that day and actually introducing himself and spending a few moments. I had the opportunity to tell him how I think this whole thing actually has ripped the heart out of both airports. A lot of the people I will have here as neighbors in this airport are some of the finest people I've ever known, ever had an opportunity to fly with. This is described as a cancer, okay? Being a physician, I might actually know a little bit about this. It is. It may not be ovarian or pancreatic, but this thing has been interminable. I mean, it doesn't seem to want to go away. And it just seems to crawl off and make and mutate in manners that are most disturbing. For me, my concern is that, aviation is something my family is involved in. I just acquired a trainer that my boys just got their private pilot's license in. And this hangar makes that possible. Without that, there's no place to center it. And, I may not be around in 20 years, but I imagine they will be in the community. And after 20 years, what happens? Do I get an opportunity to actually renegotiate this? Or, because, the revision has been, the word has been out there every so often. And that is the very concerning and very, devious way to kind of snap it back at the end. I want to know that in 20 years that, they have an opportunity to come to you and say, yeah, okay, it's time for another lease. Let's do something fair. Let's do something that's reasonable. And, that's where that's probably my biggest concern. I thank you very much, and I defer the rest of my time.
Thank you very much. Mr. Owen Smith, you are up, and Doug Schoen, you are on deck.
My name is Owen Smith. I'm a private hangar owner at Oxnard. As a matter of fact, I was involved in the construction of the 3 most recent private hangars at Oxnard about 15 years ago, right? Anyway, since then, I have largely moved to Idaho, now resident of Idaho. So I'm one of those out-of-state hangar owners, right? I come down here, fly my plane down here. I have a house down here also. Stay the winter, but stay about 4.5, 5 months. Head back to Idaho about April 1st, right? And I was down here last time, right, in August of 18, and you guys were talking about the hangar leases, and then the Andy Risk issue came up, right? So really, I was seriously considering, right, to the point of getting building permits and stuff like that, taking down my hangar and taking it up to Clark Fork, Idaho, right, where I own property and I have a hangar and I could put it there, right, and just trekking it up there and be done with it, selling my place down here and moving, right. Since then, the issue of the lease, I think, has been very largely improved, and I credit the current airport administration for doing that, right? And I don't think I have too much problem with the lease, actually, but I do have a big problem with items of trust, and I don't know how you put it, Kip, but goodwill, okay, right? That's largely gone, and the issue for that for me was this Andy Risk business, right? And if you remember about just exactly 1 year ago, I was at this the airport listening to Andy present stuff and the response from the airport authorities, including the county council and so on, right? They really didn't want to be bothered with it, right? The issue was, well, it's in court, we'll go to court. They went to court, right? They had a jury trial. I understand they lost, all right? The airport lost, and the jury found for the plaintiff, Mr. Risk, and subsequent to that, the verdict was reversed or something. Anyway, he got tossed off the airport, and really, I think that that the mistrust you have, or some of us have, for the airport administration and so on, it largely lies with the previous administration, but the new contract for private hangar leases needs to be recognize that issue, okay?
Thank you very much, Mr. Smith. Doug Schoen, you are up, and Mr. Brian Pierrick, you are on deck.
Good evening. I'd like you to take a moment and look around this room and see how many people showed up. Now, we have Corona-19, right? We're supposed to be 6 feet apart from one another. We're supposed to be putting Purell on our hands. Me, I'm a troubleshooter. I get up at 4:30 a.m. I live out in Topanga. So it's a haul for me to come here in the rain, right? But I'm here. I was here at the last meeting, which was the aviation advisory meeting, where this future rental owner's contract was rejected. And I'm asking you to do the same, to reject the contract that's in front of you right now, just until we make some changes to it that correct the verbiage, such as we've seen tonight. Some examples of the flawed, vague lease is the 20-year transferability, which is Section 2. Section 8, the airworthiness, right? My particular aircraft, I'm on my second hangar at Camarillo. I came from Santa Monica. I didn't have a hangar in Santa Monica. I was just on the field. I came to Camarillo because everyone said this is a wonderful place to be, which it was. And I came out here and I bought a hangar right over by Air 7.